What's up, guys? It's Matt, and welcome back to Mix Series. So right now we're going to go ahead and get this mix started. So I've got my virtual playback already set up, and we are loaded up here on the X32, running into the card inputs, and we have it all running through my X32 routing templates. I have all of the EQ and compression turned off on the drums because that's where we're going to be starting. And yeah, we can go ahead and jump in. So real quick caveat, just so you're aware of this, there's no polish at all happening on the multi-tracks that we're working from. These are just a random Sunday session, I think, from this previous weekend. So I wanted to work with multi-tracks that weren't perfect by any means. This is a pretty normal service for us. Let's go ahead and jump in. Something to be aware of for kick, I usually don't run two kick microphones, a kick in and a kick out, unless I absolutely need to. The kick that I have set up in the room that this was recorded in, because I have all the waves processing, I typically use R-Bass on a kick in, and it works really well for me. And I feel like it gives me plenty of low end. I can dial in where that the low frequency is really getting punching through. So I prefer to do it that way with it's kind of a kick in microphone that is then adding some low end to it. In this scenario, it's not perfect. I feel like I am lacking a little bit of low end in the kick. I already listened to that. So just be aware of that. I think everything else is pretty much the way I would normally do it. But if I was running an X32 every single week and I wanted to get a really boomy, thick low end in my bass or in my kick, I would probably use two kick microphones if I have the channels for it. Now that's the key there, is that sometimes you don't, and I find that most people that I'm working with, most churches that I work with, don't typically run two kick microphones. So it's kind of one of those things. If you want the attack of that kick in, it definitely sounds good, but you do need to make sure that they're both in phase and you're processing them correctly. And there's some things that you want to be aware of when you're working with two kick mics. So let's go ahead and dive in. So kick. Let's start with kick. I have all of my bus processing is turned off. I'm going to dive into this a little bit later in this video, but we're going to be doing we're just running through my dry group. So none of the parallel processing is on this. Yeah, so the kick mic that we have, that we're listening to, is an RE320. And it does sound pretty good. It's in the kick mic mode. It's actually got a specific mode for being used as a kick microphone, which is kind of cool. I prefer the Audix D6 as a single mic. So if like you're only using one mic, I think the Audix D6 does sound better. It's a little bit more like pre-EQ'd, if that makes sense. But I do like the RE320. I think it sounds pretty good. Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive in. I've already got input gain set up. So we're going to blend this up. So this is the entire drum kit, just dry with no processing on it at all. So out of the gate, I'm just listening for the whole kit, completely dry, unprocessed. I just pulled the levels kind of up where generally just up to 0 for the most part. I want to hear what everything is actually giving me, what each microphone is giving me completely unprocessed. I think it's important to know where you're starting from before you really start to process things. You need to know, like there's things that are jumping out to me immediately when I hear this, that are areas where I want to fix some problems, and then maybe areas that I want to bring up a little bit more, things that I think sound good. I did notice when I just pulled those dry channels up, my snare sounds a little papery. I think the tuning on that was a little off, and it could be down to how hard he's hitting that snare right there. I do tend to tune my snares a little bit higher. Personally, I like that. It just does require you to really smack them good. I think if you don't, a 14x8, if you're playing it light and it's tuned high, can tend, I feel like, to sound a little off. It doesn't get that big punchy sound that you typically like. I think it's more than manageable. We're gonna make it sound pretty good. Just to be aware of what your source tones are doing. So let's go ahead and mute everything or pull the faders down. And we're just gonna look at kick right now. So my input gain looks pretty good. It's sitting around -12 right now. A little bit higher, that's fine. It's totally fine. Let's go to our EQ and start to make some adjustments here. So immediately I'm noticing that my kick has that little bit of that like basketball sound, that like kind of slappy sound. Usually that's going to be around like 2 to 3K. I also am noticing some of that, a little bit of muddiness in the low end. Part of that's specifically what like low frequencies this microphone is picking up. Again, not much I'm going to be able to do about that. It's picking up a little bit higher than where I would typically want. So my kick, let's go ahead and do some EQ adjustments here, and I will come back and kind of explain what I did once I'm done, just so I'm not talking over it the whole time. All right, let's listen to the before and after. So before EQ. After EQ. All right, so big difference there, and there's going to be a lot of processing that we're doing just in the EQ right there. So the big things, like I said, it had that little bit of a basketball type sound. So the first thing that I went for was the thing that was immediately jumping out to me, which was that attack that's up there around that 3K area. So I'm using my high mid filter to tackle some of that. The other thing that I noticed was in that mid-range, this is like every single drum shell, you're going to notice this for the most part, unless you're using some wild microphones that, you know, I'm not using. But generally speaking, in that low mid-range, you're going to want to cut quite a bit and scoop that out. It's just not very pleasant. There's nothing pleasant happening down there. So that's what I did with my low mid filter. Notice I'm cutting a lot there, and I think that's something that might terrify people, is how much I'm cutting there. But like I think it sounds good, so we're gonna roll with it. And we may come back to the kick later if it's not cutting through the mix the way I want. It's not like anything is set in stone necessarily when we're doing this. So, and then the last thing I did was I pulled some low up quite a bit, actually. May add more there. We'll see how hard we're hitting everything later. Just depends. I'm also running in-ears, which don't recreate lows super great. So hopefully they're pretty on. I feel like that's pretty solid where it's at. May make some adjustments later. Okay, so EQ on the kick is relatively good. I feel like that's pretty solid there. Oh yeah, last thing I did on the high filter, I turned that to a bell, and I'm just adding a touch of attack around that 8K mark. Don't want to add to that basketball type sound that's a little bit lower in that like 3K area. So I'm kind of bringing up those high attack sounds and pulling down those basketball-y sounds. So yeah, that's what we're doing there. Okay, so the next thing on the kick that I want to tackle is gate. So if you notice, you can kind of hear like in the background, there's some cymbal bleed. There's quite a bit of stuff from the snare. It's not too bad. I've heard worse kicks as far as bleed goes. That is one thing about this mic I think it does pretty well at is handling bleed. It's not a huge deal. We're going to use a gate, which I kind of explained in the previous videos. We're going to use a gate to kind of tackle some of that bleed. So let's pull this up, and I'm going to dial in the gate, and then I'm going to come back and explain what I did. All right, before. Okay, so yeah, that's generally pretty close with the gate. We may notice if we later in the set, we may notice we need to dial in our gates a little bit differently. That just kind of depends on what kind of songs you're playing, who your drummer is, how they like to play the kick. I am noticing that he isn't, he's not being totally consistent with his velocity on the kick. Kind of is what it is. So we may have to pull it down just a little bit. And we're really kind of trying to find that balance where only the kick is coming through the gate when we set the gate, and you're not getting like snare or maybe like toms in there as well. It's mainly that snare. It's picking up the snare a lot. And I think that right where we have it is pretty close. We're gonna see though, if he keeps playing like this, I think we're fine. But yeah, so we have our attack. Attack is really important with your gates, especially on gates that aren't really super high quality, like this one. Attack is one of those things on a gate where you got to be really careful, especially on drum sounds. You don't want to lose the attack of the shell itself, like hearing that transient, the initial like punch of the kick. But you also don't want it to click open. And sometimes gates do this thing where they click. I want you to hear this, so we're gonna try to listen for it. So that would be too far. I'm starting to eat into the transient. But there's just a subtle click right at the beginning of the gate. So I'm gonna run it at 1 millisecond. I find on the X32, usually you can get rid of that click with about a 1 millisecond attack on the gate. It's not perfect. Sometimes you gotta run it a little bit higher than that to get rid of the click. And then sometimes you just have to kind of, you know, accept that the click of the gate opening up is kind of what it is. Sometimes it's more important to preserve the attack of the actual instrument instead of trying to get rid of that click. It just depends on what's coming through the house and really drawing your attention. It is one of those things, I think hearing it in playback, like in your headphones or however you're listening right now, may not be as dramatic. You may not notice it as much as when you go and play that through the PA, you'll hear that little just like of the gate opening up. Hold here, this is something I didn't mention earlier. Hold is just basically how long. So if the gate is opening, how long does it wait before releasing? So if a release, you can imagine attack is how quickly it opens, and then as soon as it drops below the threshold, it'll immediately begin to release. Hold is basically saying, okay, I want you to hold this gate open no matter how long that transient is. I want you to hold the gate open for X amount of time. In this case, it's 25 milliseconds, and then do your release. So it'll go up, hold, release. So that's how that works. On the kick, I am running the range at its maximum, so 60 dB. That's mainly because the kick usually isn't played in a very dynamic way. It kind of is on or off. So we can get rid of most of the bleed, especially with there being a ton of low end information in your kick. By the time it's processed, you want it to, you don't want a bunch of stuff coming through there if you can avoid it. So yeah, this is a pretty solid gate setup. One last thing I wanted to mention, you saw me jump down here to the key filter. So this is a cool feature the X32 has on it. Most good gates have this. But essentially what the key filter does is it will allow you to set the gate to where it's not just listening for the whole kick channel, you know, gain coming into the kick channel. You can actually set it to listen to control. It's basically like a control audio or a key in. If you've ever used side chaining before, that's what this is essentially. So it is using a filter to key in the gate. So you can basically say, like, if obviously the microphone's picking up a lot from that snare. Well, the snare frequencies are usually a bit higher. So those are going to be, you know, like maybe 150 and up, probably a little bit lower than that. But those snare frequencies aren't going to be as pronounced as the low end in the kick. So I know that the low end of that kick, which coming in here, I know that it's sitting in that like 100 hertz is where it's peaking pretty heavily on the EQ. I know that is a frequency that I can use to start to key in my gate. It's going to give me better results than just letting it go with no key filter. It basically just means there's going to be more separation when you're setting your threshold on your gate. So you can run your threshold a little bit lower and pick up more of the kick and avoid that situation where maybe you have the gate not opening up on every kick that's happening. The key solo, that's how you can listen to what's being keyed in. You watched me do that a second ago. And you can set the filter slope and the frequency that you're listening for. So here I have it set to 60 hertz. That I haven't really seen much like rule of thumb when it comes to that. It is going to be generally around where the fundamental of the instrument is. So in this case, it's going to be close to where that low end of the kick is, but it is a little bit higher. So it's not going to be perfectly at 60 hertz or at 50 or 40, maybe a little bit lower. It is going to be a little bit higher. Generally speaking, that isn't always the case, but in this situation it is. So let's continue on. So we've got kick. We need to get compressed a little bit. We are doing some bus compression. So my first round of compression on the drum shells is not very dramatic. I try not to do too much with one compressor, especially with compressors that don't sound super great. It's best to kind of spread the load out as much as you possibly can. So that's why I'm using a 2 bus compressors, actually 3 bus compressors between all of my drum buses. So my channel compression, all I'm trying to do is kind of get just that first round of compression on that kick. I just want it to kind of sit a little bit less dynamic, just a little bit more consistent. And I'm not trying to do too much with it. I'm just going to aim for around 3 dB of reduction on this kick. So we're going to pull this up. So it's off. And then on. All right, so you can see kind of what we're doing with the compressor there. So it's really just that first round of compression, not doing anything too crazy with it. Just trying to level out those peaks a little bit. So you notice I set my ratio to 4 on that. And then my attack, see my attack is sitting at around 30 milliseconds. That's done so that you don't compress the transient, that first initial transient of the shell. So every time he hits that kick, you've got that big boom burst of energy that happens. I want to preserve that. I'm only trying to really catch the tail of the sound and just trying to kind of smooth it out just a little bit. There's more compression that we're going to do later in our bus compression that is going to that will be set super quick. So I'm not doing that here quite yet. So that's pretty close to my kick sound. Nothing too fancy there. So let's move on to our snare, and we're going to kind of blow through these now that I've explained most of what we're doing. So our snare, let's pull it up. Make sure our drum verb is muted because we don't need it right now. Our input gain is sitting right about where we want it. Again, remember, we only have control over trim in this scenario because we are dialing in, we've already got the recording from the preamps, and we're not controlling any preamps. There's no preamps to control. We're just controlling the digital trim coming from my computer. But still, I'm making sure that it's sitting where I want it to. And it's sitting around that -12 mark, maybe just a touch higher when he really hits it, but that's fine. So the snare, again, I noticed it was sounding a little bit papery. We're going to go through and I'm going to process this with EQ first, and I'll explain what I did with EQ and then go through some gate and compression quickly. So this is snare top. I am not touching snare bottom yet. We'll do snare bottom in just a second. All right, before, with no low cut. Low cut. EQ. Cool. So you can see we're doing a lot of tone shaping there, and that is that's something that you're going to probably end up having to do quite a bit on your snare. It's still giving me everything I'm looking for. Like it's got that nice punchy around that like high 100s, around 200 hertz. I usually tune my snares so the fundamental's not too much higher than that, because that's, you know, it's starting to get into a competitive frequency space. So I really want it to get that punchy, almost like chest hit sound right there. So that's why I've got this little bit of a boost going on here, just to kind of bring that up a little bit. You notice I ran my high cut up to pretty much the low end of the stuff that I'm trying to pick up. I'm sorry, I may have said high cut, low cut. I ran my low cut up to 153 hertz, and my low, I'm boosting a little bit. You see my low mids around that 700, that 600 to 700 mark, 700 hertz. I am cutting a lot there. That is one thing you'll notice with dynamic microphones, especially on stuff that is really loud and punchy and fast, like a snare drum, that typically you are going to need to cut a lot in the low mids in that space to get it to sound similar to what you're hearing in the room if you were to just play it dry. It's just the nature of dynamic microphones. Typically, they tend to get a lot of that like proximity effect, build up stuff going on in the low end that just, it doesn't tend to sound super pleasant or natural, so you end up having to cut a lot. That's why you typically see that, and it is something to be aware of. If you're cutting a lot in your low mids, typically you'll scoop the mids out of your drums and you'll be like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. Be careful with that, because you will start to fight the battle later on of really struggling to get your snare to kind of cut through the mix if it's lost all of its body. So just be aware of that. You don't necessarily want it to sound like a fake, like one of those old like super 80s snares, which is like choom, choom. You don't necessarily want it to sound like that. You want it to sound pretty natural, ideally. So that's the snare top, and it already sounds fairly natural, but I think when we blend the snare bottom in, it's going to sound a lot better. Really quick, before we go to snare bottom, let's go ahead and set our gate. And we're going to see if a gate makes more sense or an expander makes more sense in this situation. So I think that sounds pretty good. At least on this song, there may be a different song that comes up where, you know, the gate might make more sense as an expander, or it may make more sense to run your range and threshold a little bit different. So again, I'm using my filter. You saw that, and you can see that it's sitting a little bit higher than the fundamental of the actual drum itself. It's sitting up in that, like in the low mids, 432 hertz is where the filter, the key filter is being set. I'm not running my range extremely steep on this because I'm actually noticing I'm not getting a ton of bad bleed. That is something to be aware of. Not all bleed is bad. It doesn't sound horrible. It's not something like I'm getting a ton of cymbals in there that's really unmanageable. The idea is I don't want to be able to hear my gates. When the whole drum mix is put together, I don't want to hear my gates opening and closing. It can be really unpleasant, and your drummers will hate that, because especially if you're running your drum IEMs from front of house, if they're using P16s or something where it's all post-processing and they're hearing with the gates on, they're going to hate you for it. And it's going to be a battle that you're going to be fighting all the time. So I kind of have it set up to where I'm imagining a drummer playing, and maybe they're rolling. Maybe they're doing like a snare roll that wouldn't be fully opening the gate. I still want to hear that roll. Now on my snare top, I can get away with a little bit more of a gate because that is that specific mic. I'm kind of using the philosophy would be, I guess, the snare top would be more of those lower punchy frequencies from the snare. And that snare bottom is going to get more of the delicate stuff that you're going to get if you're doing like a snare roll. And you kind of want to try to play a little bit of a balance there between your snare top and snare bottom. So I will let the snare bottom come in sooner so that whenever you're doing the snare rolls, you're going to hear the snare wires open up. And then maybe later, as the velocity increases, the snare top will open up. So by the time we blend in snare bottom, it may make more sense, like I'm saying, to close the gate just a little bit with the range on snare top. But let's go ahead and add some EQ, or I'm sorry, compression. We're going to do the same basic concept that we're doing with kick. All of my shell mics, my kick, snare, rack, and floor tom are all going to be compressed in basically the same way. I'm trying to do and accomplish the same task for the most part. So let's go ahead and compress our snare top. Yep, that's a pretty good starting point. So let's go ahead and move on to snare bottom quickly. So snare bottom, this is what it's going to be picking up. We've got the EQ cleared. Listen to snare bottom on its own. And you can hear it's mainly getting those snare wires. However, I am going to process snare, both top and bottom, in a very similar way. I want those two microphones, I want the difference in those microphones. Listening to them, I want to hear the difference coming from more their positioning, more so than how I'm actually shaping them tonally. I think that they just tend to fit better if you don't try to think about processing your bottom as like this is only picking up my snare wire, so I'm going to take all the low end out, or this is my top is only for the body, so I'm not going to add any top end to my snare. I just find personally, for me, it works better to think about your snare top and bottom EQ and compression wise as being basically the same thing. You're just picking it up from two places, so you're going to want them to be shaped tonally in a similar fashion. So let's go ahead and we're about to start EQing snare bottom. One thing I do want to check. So snare and any drum microphone, because your drums are so close together and they're all picking up the same sounds, they're going to have a phase relationship. And without diving into the absolute insanity that is talking about phase and music and polarity and all that. Essentially, when it comes to two microphones, so you have two microphones that are picking up the same source. In this case, it's a snare top and a snare bottom. When I hit the snare, those two microphones are different distances from that initial impact that the sound is coming from. They are two distances away. And obviously sound is very quick, but in reality, it's not that fast. So when those frequencies are hitting each one of those microphones, they're hitting them at different times. Well, sound waves go like this, right? So you have peaks and valleys in that waveform, and whenever you have two microphones, so you have two mics and your waveforms are doing this. If one is dropping while the other one is rising in time, that would be in phase. Now, what happens if for some reason you have two microphones that are slightly out of sync with each other? Then what you're going to have is you're going to have a waveform rising while a waveform is decreasing. And if they're picking up the same source, what will begin to happen is called phase cancellation. Those two things, when they combine into one sound, will actually cancel each other out. And that's what you have. That was a very rudimentary, easy explanation of what can happen. But what we need to do practically is we need to check whether or not our snare top microphone and our snare bottom microphone are in phase with each other. And if they are not, then we need to flip the polarity of our snare bottom mic so that it is in phase, or at least they are summing together in a good way. So let's pull them up together, snare top and snare bottom. And what we're going to listen for is we want to listen for body, basically. If you get more body and low end coming from being in or out of polarity, polarity being in or out, whichever one, when we flip the polarity, gives us more body is essentially going to be the indicator that that is going to be at least more in phase than if the polarity was flipped. So we do that by up here in our preamp section. There's a little button. It's a circle with a cross through it. That is going to flip the polarity. So instead of the waveform going like this, it would go like this. So that's what we're going to look for. So let's pull snare top up, snare bottom. All right, so here to me, it's pretty obvious snare bottom needs to be flipped. And most of the time, I will say, especially if you're using a 14x8 snare, it just so happens to be that when you line up the snare microphones the way that I do, and they're measured properly, the distance is all correct for what you're used to, most of the time I am going to be flipping the polarity. It's always something that I check because it's not always the case. Say if a mic gets bumped or something, it's not always going to be that way. But in this situation, it definitely makes sense to flip the polarity. So you notice that when they sum together, you get a little bit more low end. Let's continue processing our snare bottom. We need to add an EQ, some gate, and some compression. No EQ. With EQ. So you notice we processed it very similarly to our snare top. Let's go ahead and add some gate to it. All right, let's compress. All right, let's blend our snare top and snare bottom together, see what happens. Let's hear kick and snare together. Cool. So that's a great place to start. Let's keep rolling. We're going to run through our, we're going to pull up actually our overheads real quick, because what I want to do is I usually check phase in this way, and I usually will do my, my sound check like this in the same order that I'm checking phase. So snare top and snare bottom, and then I'm going to skip over my toms, and then I'm going to go to my my overheads and check my overheads to my snare. My overheads are a spaced pair, so they're not in the exact same spot, like in an XY or anything like that. If they were in an XY, then I would actually probably link those, stereo link them. That way my EQs would be exactly the same across both. They are, though, they're far away from each other, so they're like, they're in a triangle, an equilateral triangle with the far edge of my snare, the one that is closest to my kick drum. For me, I like to have control over those individually to process them, just because your ride is over here as a drummer, and there may be something that you want to take out a little bit more of this overhead over here compared to this one. Now you do want to be careful still. The way EQ works, again, it's EQ will shift things around in the phase world, and you need to be careful not to have two sources that are either a stereo capture or a something where you're going to be capturing the same thing, that you're going to be EQing dramatically different, because they will start to move things around in the phase world, and you just have to be aware of that happening. So let's go ahead and keep our kick and snare in. And I'm going to pull up my stage left overhead. I'm going to go ahead and pan it center, because I'm going to be checking phase first. I'm going to do the same thing with my stage right overhead. And let's see where we're at. All right, so on the stage left overhead, let me mute those. On the stage left overhead, you probably heard when, because, I mean, I'm picking up everything going on there. You heard the kick all of a sudden came through super punchy whenever I flipped polarity. The thing that I wanted to listen for there was both the kick and the snare. They're both going to be coming through the overheads, so that's something that I want to be aware of. Hopefully, I got my measurements pretty accurate when I was setting up the drums on this, if I was the one that even did it in this recording. Hopefully, it's accurate, and they're going to be pretty close, but the reality is that there is no way to get a perfect summation phase when it comes to your snare and your kick and your overheads. You have two different ears, think of them as ears, listening up in the top of your drum cage or wherever you have them. Up here, your snare is going to be right here. But if your snare is perfectly summing, say you get your measurements perfect to the center of your snare, whatever, and your kick now is not, because your kick is a different distance and you've measured from here to here. So that's why it's not a perfect science. You kind of want to base it off of what gives you the best results. I think personally for me, going from the lug that is closest to my kick drum from my snare gives me the kind of the closest middle ground there. And what I'm hearing here is that it's not making a massive difference when I flip polarity on this microphone to my snare, but it is making a pretty big difference with the kick. It's not making a bad change. When I make the sacrifice for my kick to come through nice, it's not making a bad change to the snare. So I am going to flip polarity on this, and hopefully my two overheads are, are the same. So I should have to flip polarity on my stage right overhead as well. In theory, they should be relatively the same distance from the kick, but we'll see. And I'm noticing the same thing happening there. So I'm going to flip polarity now on my overheads. And then when we move to the toms, if the toms are out of phase with my overheads, then I'll flip the toms. So I go in order from snare to overheads to toms, and usually that gives me good results. So let's go ahead and process our overheads. I do very, very light processing on my overheads. I'm not doing much. I don't compress them hardly at all. Truthfully, I don't even know if I have a compressor on this template on my overheads. It's very, very minor if I do. It doesn't look like I do right now. So let's go ahead and pan our overheads. Actually, I'm not going to pan them yet. I'm going to pull one up and kind of process it. And then I'm going to copy that processing over to the other one, see if there's anything that sticks out. If there is, then I'll go and individually change something. But if not, I'm going to leave it alone if I can. So let's go ahead and pull the stage left one up. All right, so I feel pretty good about that one. I think that that's right about where I would have it. Do keep in mind, if you do use a drum cage, there is usually going to be a little bit of buildup in those low mids. And that is what I'm having here. You could hear the whole kit kind of reflecting around inside the glass. Different drum cages handle this in different ways and are less obvious about it. The bigger the drum cage is, the better, because you're going to get less of that like direct reflection off the glass. We have one of those like fishbowl ones, and it does get a little bit of reflection in there, so it is something to be aware of. Drum cages are a sacrifice. There's no way around it. But overall in your mix, it's gonna sound better. I am using C414s on this, AKGs, and they sound pretty good, sound pretty natural. And I'm not having to touch them too much. I took a little bit of those low mids out, and you notice I am not rolling my high pass filter up that much, or my low cut, as the X32 calls it. I'm not rolling it all the way up. I'm just trying to get the subby stuff out. I don't really need any of that. It's just not beneficial to me. So I'm cutting most of that out, but I'm not rolling way up high. I think I've seen a lot of people that will roll their overheads up to like 300 or 400 hertz. I do not do that. I try to think of my overheads as if I didn't have any of my shell mics, what would be a good sound for my overheads? If that was like the only mics I had to work with, and then try to kind of blend everything else with them. So remember, they're not just cymbal mics, they are picking up the entire kit. And you really want to try to leave them as untouched as possible. So that's why I'm a big believer in getting the best overheads that you possibly can for the money. I think that's an area where you can get a lot of bang for your buck in mixing world, is spend the money on overheads, get good overheads. It'll make a big difference. The other thing is too, cymbals. You can hear I'm getting a lot of those shells. The cymbals are very dark. They're, really nice Istanbul cymbals, and they're pretty large. They sound pretty good. So that is something to know, is that, the higher quality stuff when it comes to cymbals and your overheads, it's going to give you a much better drum sound. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and copy this over to my other overhead. You did notice I put a little bit of compression on there. It's not much. I am running my my attack a little bit higher because I'm not trying to cut into the transient of the shells. I want all the punchiness that I can get here. Then we'll do some other processing later. So let's go ahead and go to our EQ. I'm going to go to, if I can remember how to do this, home and utility. That's it. And I'm going to go from channel 6. I'm going to copy. And then over here on channel 7, I will select it. And I'm going to set all of this. I don't need any of that. Don't need my name and icon, don't need my sends, just the gate, compressor, and EQ. I could turn the gate off too because I'm not even using it. And I'm going to paste to channel 7. And now I have both of my overheads processed identically except for the low cut, which I can go ahead and get dialed in. So 121. And I will pan them left and right. Overhead stage right, I'm going to pan to the left, and overhead stage left, I'm going to pan to the right. I pan based on, when I'm running front of house, I will pan based on what you're seeing from the audience. So everything on the left side, from your point of view, will be panned to the left, and everything on the right will be panned that way. I think it makes more sense to do it that way in this context. Now, once you get into the studio, I will disagree. Unless you're doing something that is heavily videoed from the audience. Then it kind of depends on what angles of the drummer you're getting. Again, I think it's, people make a bigger deal out of it than it really is. It's not something to think about too much. Yeah, people overthink things. The only people that will notice, I will say, the only people that will ever say anything is your drummer. And if it's not from the drummer's perspective, they get annoyed. But at front of house, it makes more sense to do it like that. So we've got our overheads basically done. Let's see how they sum together. I'm liking that. Let's move on to toms real quick. So we have our floor tom, our rack tom, and our floor tom. I'm going to go to a section of this song that you can hear the toms the biggest. Here we go. Let's do rack tom. Okay, so these are MD421s, and they sound pretty good. They're very open sounding. That is sometimes a battle with toms that you got to fight. But let's go ahead and process these. I'm going to run through EQ, gate, and compression. I'm not going to do a super heavy compression on these again. Even toms, I run even less because they are a little bit more dynamic than some of the other shells. So yeah, let's run through rack tom. I'm going to center it. All right, let's move on to the floor tom. And we're done here. We'll come back and check phase with the overheads. All right, cool. So I know I just kind of blew through those. There was no reason to stop. I think you guys were able to follow there, hopefully. So we've got our drum sound pretty much done. We're going to unmute everything, listen to what everything sounds like, and then we're going to blend in a little bit of reverb on our drums. Pull some reverb up. Okay, so we've got our dry drum sound set up. Now notice we haven't added a ton of compression yet. We're gonna start to blend that in with our drum crush and our kick snare buses. So drum dry, if you don't know what parallel compression is, the way it works basically is you have two parallel buses, and one is uncompressed or lightly compressed, and the other one is going to be really compressed. And it's going to be relatively quick compression, and the idea is that you get a bunch of sustain and saturation from that bus. And then the dry bus is where you're going to keep the natural sound of everything. And then you can kind of blend those to taste. So you'll notice I have my compressor up for my drum dry. You can see I don't have any compression happening. My drum crush, you'll see it's crushed pretty heavily. These are some pretty good compression settings that I will tend to go to for my crush bus. And then I have one more that is a mono bus that's just for my kick and snare, and it is slamming. So I'll kind of let you hear these in isolation real quick. So this is the drum dry. Mute my verb. This is the crush. So pretty compressed. And then my kick snare. It sounds wild. And now let's blend them all in to taste. Pull our verb back in. Pull it up just a little bit. And that is pretty close to where I would leave it and move on to something else. So hope this was helpful for drums. I know drums is a big topic, and there's things that we didn't necessarily fully talk about. But hopefully this is a good starting point for you with drums. Reverb, as far as reverb goes, there's not really anything crazy I'm doing here. If you want to see my reverb settings specifically for my drums, I'm using this rich plate reverb. There's a number of good, on the X32, there's a number of good options. I think that the like vintage room one sounds pretty good too. I typically like to have multiple reverbs for my drums, like a gated one and then maybe like a longer one. But since we only have 4 like reverb effects buses to work with on the whole console, I am only using one, and that's what I'm doing here. So my snare and my toms are both going to the same one. Notice how I didn't turn any overheads up in my verbs. I don't use verb on any of my overhead mics or anything like that. It's only on my my shells, so my toms and my my snare. In context, you're going to kind of need to see how the verb sounds with the rest of the mix. Usually I find that I end up turning my snare or my verbs up a little bit once the whole mix kind of comes in. I like to kind of hear that drum verb a little bit more. So sometimes in isolation, when you're just hearing the drums, the verb will sound crazy, too hot. And then when you actually pull in with the rest of the mix, it starts to make sense. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys for drums. In the next video, we're going to kind of move a little bit quicker because we're done with drums. So we can run through bass and keys and electrics and stuff. So looking forward to the next video, guys.